Welcome to the 16th episode of the podcast. This is your proprietor, Tony Ortega, coming to you from an undisclosed location deep inside the interior of the Earth's crust, otherwise known as the underground bunker. Earlier this week, we received a surprise. It was a message from someone we haven't heard from in a few years, and someone we really admired. It was Mirriam Francis, who made such a strong impression during Leah Remini's second season of Scientology in the Aftermath, and who also helped us out with a couple of pieces here at the bunker. If you haven't seen her episode of The Aftermath in a while, which was the premiere episode of the second season, you really should reacquaint yourself with it to remember what a brave act it was for her to reveal that she had been abused by her own Sea Org father in Scientology. She gave us a great piece to publish this week to help us understand what it's like to come forward with allegations of abuse, in the hopes that it helps us understand a little of what Danny Masterson's accusers are going through as they wait for the trial to begin this week. And even better, she agreed to talk to us from Australia for the podcast. Mirriam Francis, wow, it's so great to hear from you again. And thank you so much for writing a piece for us this week and also agreeing to be on the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm going really well. Thank you so much, Tony. It's really great to hear your voice and have a chat with you. And yes, I did. I wrote a bit of a piece for you. What I wanted to do is try to help in the understanding of what it takes to go through a process like this. And I guess to sort of help with, give some understanding of just a hint of maybe what some of the experience of what those women who are going through this trial with Danny Masterson. And what I wanted to do, rather than just say, this is how it is, or, you know, this is what the experience is like. What I wanted to do is sort of draw on my own experience and talk through what that felt like. What did that look like to me? How did that feel when I went through my own process? And also just those aspects of where my process was kind of thwarted or directed because of the influences of Scientology. And I'm hoping that it will give people, hopefully, some kind of understanding of what it takes to go through each part of that process. And it's like little tiny steps. And that's what I wanted to kind of portray in what I wrote.
Well, you did a wonderful, wonderful job. Thank you so much for sending that in.
Thank you.
But let's remind some of our newer readers who you are. I became aware of you when you showed up in the opening episode of Leah Remini's second season of
Yes.
Scientology and the Aftermath. And the first season was terrific, but wow, what a way to open the second season with these harrowing stories of what children go through in
Yes.
Scientology, particularly the ones that have been through abuse.
Yes.
Can you just remind our viewers, just our readers, listeners, just a little bit what that episode was like for you?
Yeah, it was so the episode I did with Sina Kamula. We had grown up within the Church of Scientology from very young ages. We knew each other. We were best friends, and we shared some similar experiences. Definitely the same experiences in terms of lack of an education, the abuses that occurred. Um, and we also experienced sexual assaults. It was really important in doing that story with the aftermath. It was to take people into the past of how it was for us to be raised in that environment, and some of the things that we were subjected to. And for us, it was the first time that we were speaking out publicly, and it was a very nerve-wracking experience, and it was very tough. Yeah, but for me, it did provide. Once I said those things in a public way, it gave me a sense of relief because it was my way of obtaining some form of justice for myself.
Right. And Subsequent to the episode, I think both you and Sina went to the LAPD, right?
So, yes, captured in the episode, the LAPD came to us. We did a report on each of our respective own cases. And unfortunately, that hasn't gone anywhere. Yeah, I've sort of really hit a wall with my case. And so just going back, and I cover this a little bit in the episode where I first, and this is in my article as well, when I first made my official written statement to the police was 2012. And then it was investigated over the course of the next few years. And in 2015, the Australian police, well, it was taken to the decision of whether or not it would be prosecuted or not. And it was decided, well, my father, who is the perpetrator, lives in the US. And so it was decided that they would send my case over to the US authorities. Now it goes via Interpol and then it's passed on. Now that occurred in 2015 where it was sent from Australia. Now at the end of 2016, the statute of limitations in California were lifted. And some of the instances of abuse occurred, sexual abuse occurred in Los Angeles when my father was in the Sea organization. And so, what LAPD has come back to me with is to say, well, you've lodged your report with us in 2017, but your original report was sent in 2015. So, we need to determine when that was received in the US to determine whether or not the statute of limitations applies.
Right. And basically, it just hasn't gone anywhere, right?
Yeah, and so they've said, well, we can't locate that original filing or that report from
Mm,
Australia and where that
okay.
landed or whether it did land, which is kind of quite insane, really, if you think about it. So they can't take the case any further in the state of California because they don't know whether or not or when my original case arrived. So it's just madness. The other thing that they said is that, well, we can't locate um, your father, Chris Francis. And I've been able to locate him actually with the help of a journalist. We were able to locate him. He's actually since been contacted. My uncle contacted him. My father provided a written confession via email. Um, Now, he admits to the incidences that occurred in Australia, but he conveniently cannot recall incidents which occurred within the US.
Mm, I see.
So yeah, it's just a really tricky thing, and also I think the thing is that you really have to balance out, you know, how much do you want to give to this? Like I've got, you know, my family that I want to give my time to and be there for. I want to enjoy my life, and at each step of the way, this is a very long process. Um, you have to decide how much you want to give to it, if that makes sense. Like how much energy and emotion and um, time and effort. It can be a very exhausting process. So the way that I've balanced that out is to take little steps at a time. And that when I was ready to do a particular step, I would do that. And then I'd, give myself some space for a little while and just sort of balance things out that way.
Well, and then there's more. So you're saying your father has admitted to something that happened in Australia,
Yes.
but not in the U.S.
Yes. So
But but
he admitted to several instances of
oh wow,
it, to his
okay.
admission of when, which occurred in Australia. Now, I left Australia when I was turning 6 years old. I sort of arrived in Los Angeles, just having turned six. So, yeah, so he admitted to several instances which took place during the time period. Um, so my mother left to LA, so she wasn't present. So it was during the time that she wasn't present. So it occurred over probably about a year and a half to 2 year period. Yeah.
Well, there's that other layer that I wanted to bring in, and that's
Mm,
your mother, because you wrote about this for us as well.
yes.
That not only are you dealing with being raised in Scientology and your father even admitting to these violations, but in the world of Scientology, of course, they keep everything inside.
Yes.
Doesn't go to authorities. So it's been very difficult to get any justice. But on top of all that,
Yeah.
your mother is also completely dedicated to Scientology.
Mm,
And you wrote a really, really moving piece for us about kind of discovering how deep that dedication went for her to
yes.
Scientology, and sort of she cut you out of her life earlier than you even realized.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and that's such a good point. And actually, there's a few things that you've touched on there, which are really important. So just to track back, my parents were in the Sea Org when I was born. So essentially, I was born into it. They were in the Sea Org in Sydney, and my mother was then recruited over to Los Angeles to. She was a really great, an amazing oil painter prior to working for Scientology. So she's recruited to Los Angeles. And actually, Mike Rinder in the episode, he mentions that he was involved in that, or um, he knew of it, or yeah, I think that he was involved in the project because the project was to create this life exhibition, this story of L. Ron Hubbard's life. And so my mother was recruited over there to create these oil paintings, which you'll still see there today. There's a series of oil paintings depicting different parts of his life. So while she was over there doing that, my father, he then left the Sea Org to raise myself and my brothers. And we, yeah, and so at that stage, that's when the sexual assaults occurred. So now, at the time of when I did the aftermath, I wasn't very comfortable with talking about in detail what had happened. I just hadn't reached that point in my process of where I was able to vocalize that. But um, I'm more comfortable in talking about it now. So we'll say that. So when the incidents occurred, they were sort of quite uniform. They were always in the middle of the night. I was asleep. I would wake up to them happening. Um, and I would sort of go through this process of like, oh, what's going on? I wanted it to stop. It was incredibly terrifying and confusing. It was just very difficult to understand what was going on. And at the time, I developed this thing where I would, because I was just like, I just want to die. I want to escape this so badly. Like, just kill me. I just want to die. I just want to not exist. And at that point, I I would just black out. So I have these blackout memories, these parts of my memories that are just completely black. Anyway, so it's been really difficult uh, to try and remember some of these things and to talk about them, and especially in the police statements and all that kind of thing. It's been an incredibly long process. But going back to what to with regards to my mother, so she first knew about this when I was 12 years old. Um, she found out about it because my dad was on clearance lines to go to gold, and this comes up on his confession, and um, he then is put on a handling where has to he has to come and see me. I was at the ranch school at the time, and he confessed to me what he did. Um,
And
and he's
let me just
yeah,
explain to some of our non-Scientology people what you just explained is that
yes,
um, when you join the Sea Org, you sign a billion-year contract. But inside the Sea Org, it's an incredibly hierarchical paramilitary organization,
yes,
and you're there's some there are orgs inside of orgs, and you have to you always know where the pecking order is, but only the cream of the crop got to go to this special secretive base in California called INT, or
yes,
Gold.
yeah,
And in order to get an assignment like that, especially one that's so high or high ranking like Gold,
Mm.
You had to go through these intense interrogations that are called sec checks in Scientology. They're confessionals. You have to give a full life history of all the sexual, you know, experiences you've had. And they use the thing is they use this e-meter. And what's important is the Scientologist believes that the e-meter is infallible and
Yeah.
can literally read their minds. Now, it's not true. It's just a device that measures skin galvanism. But as long as the Scientologist believes
Mm.
that this device can detect any untruth or anything, it becomes an incredibly powerful interrogation tool. And so
Yes.
Scientologists are very, they don't even, they just give up everything. So
Mhm.
even though he was essentially applying, imagine this in the outside world, that you're applying for a job or promotion at your job to go to this higher rank, but first you have to spill your guts about all these horrible things you've done to your daughter. I mean, it's just so bizarre, but that's how it
Yeah.
works in Scientology. Is that faced with the e-meter, he then spills his guts,
Yes.
admits to these things he's done to you, and then the remedy is they make him confront you with it. It's just
Yes.
amazing.
It's this is just like the tip of the iceberg. So yeah, and I should clarify when he first rejoins the Sea Org, having oh, okay, sorry, let me back up. So my mom is off in LA doing the paintings for the Life exhibition. I'm in Australia, in Sydney, for a period of about I would say it's roughly about 2 years, year and a half to 2 years. Then in 1990, we then fly. So she calls us and says, "You can come to LA now." And my dad goes through this process of like selling all of our things, and I think he had to save up for our flights and all that kind of thing. So we then go over there. My dad then rejoins the Sea Org, and at that stage, so he would be required to do a life history, but the life history is a like a written statement.
Right.
And then you do get a meter check, but that's just like a really quick meter check.
Hmm.
And so then he goes. So he joins the Sea Org, and there was this whole idea of how because my mom was still at Golden Era Productions at in base, and he was supposed to go eventually onto clearance line so that he can go to Gold, and then that would mean that us children would then get to go to the Int Ranch. And the idea my mom gave us is like, oh, and then we'll all be together. But what actually happens is that we're my brothers and I are placed into the care of Scientology in Los Angeles at a place called the CEO. My dad at the time works for CC Int, so that's where he originally starts working, and he actually works there for several years before he eventually gets into clearance lines while he's working at the Gold Rep office in Los Angeles. So there's this whole process. Now, while he's at CC, um, the abuse and my mother. So this is the other part is that getting back to my mom, she's at in base, right? So I have no contact with her. We arrive in Australia with this. We arrive in the US with this idea, like, oh, we'll be with our mom, like, how great. But we're separated from her within a few days, and we rarely see her for the rest of the time that for the rest of our childhood basically because she's placed at in base. I don't have any direct access to her. Even like the address is confidential. I never knew her address. In fact, I never even knew the address or the location until well after I left Scientology many, many, many years later. So there's this huge separation. In the meantime, the sexual abuse by my father occurs um, at least two times to my memory that I have vivid memory of. And so getting back to so he goes to the Gold Rep office and he's on clearance lines, and at this stage it's a full-blown confessional that you have to go through in order to be cleared. And at that stage and then that's where it's like really rigorous, on the e-meter. At that stage he admits to it, or he confesses to it. At this stage, I'm 12 years old, and he comes to the ranch and he tells me um, what he's done. And at the end of it, tells me to act normal. So that was my instructions. And it's like, I was just left with like, you know, nothing to support me through that. It was really, really difficult. My mother then also becomes aware of it at this time. And so then, and she doesn't try to talk to me about it or anything like that. Um, so yeah, it's just incredibly difficult just with the relationship with my mother, just all these years of separation. And then, she knows about it, doesn't do anything about it. I then struggle with this for, um, many years trying to figure out like what to do. Um, Now, just in terms of like what you touched on there with the difficulty in, um, with my mother being in Scientology and her having knowledge about it, and that being sort of something that would stop the police process. Um, yeah, it did make it incredibly difficult, and in fact, she refused to provide a police statement, even though she had, personal knowledge of it.
Well, and that's the other thing is that Scientology has known for decades
Yes,
because they got this out of him, but instead of reporting it to the police, they kept it inside because that's what they do.
correct. Correct. Yeah, it's pretty incredible. Um, and and in fact, they wouldn't let me leave unless I signed this affidavit that had been typed up for me. I had not written this, and I remember, it being, given to me, and I was just completely appalled. And it said, "I forgive my father for what he has done to me, and I'll never pursue the Church of Scientology in a court of law." And I was 17 years old, and I was leaving the Sea organization, and um, yeah, it was just like I just couldn't believe it, but I didn't have any other choice. So, I was forced to sign it. And when I say I didn't have any other choice, there's quite a bit of detail to that situation, but basically at that time I was at St. Hill in the UK. And I arrived there with just having 6 months stay on my passport. And they'd said, "Oh, that's fine. Don't worry. We'll sort that all out later." But by this stage, I'm like, I want to leave and I have 2 weeks left. And I have no money, like no education. I don't have anyone to go to and live with in the outside world. But I just could not be there any longer. And the person that was sort of like handling me at the time and was doing he'd done my sec check, and he had said, "Look, I'll help you out. I'll find you a place to stay. I wanted to go to Australia to live, go back to where I'd come from." And he was like, "Yeah, well, the only way you can do that is if you sign this statement."
Yeah.
And I was like, in the back of my mind, I was like, what's my other option? Like, I'm stuck in England, like where I'm like illegally like living. Where do I even go to live? Like, how do I feed myself? Like, how do I find a bed to sleep in? Like, it was just such a scary, going out into the outside world is already scary in itself, but then to not have a place to go to was absolutely terrifying. Um, and I just thought, well, I don't have a choice. I just have to do that.
Well, I mean, look, living in a foreign country without proper documentation,
Right.
a father who's admitted to abusing you, a mother who has known about it and doesn't do anything about it.
Yes.
I mean, there's it's an impossible situation you are in, and yet you managed to make your way, and so you went back to Australia at that
Yeah,
point.
yeah, exactly. So they had set me up with basically a place to land. I was given, it was a Scientology family that had agreed to take me in, and they had agreed to 3 months of giving me a roof over my head. And, I hoped like that would be enough. And it was scary, but it was also exciting by that stage when I was leaving. I was like, okay, like this is it. I've got a way out. Um, and I just looked at it like a real adventure. So, um, from there, I sort of just had to, yeah, I was just starting from scratch. And what I write about in the article is I'm trying to frame the time so that people can understand that, when I first arrived, my focus was on surviving and hopefully surviving well. And that's what I did for nearly 10 years after I arrived in Australia. And actually, I should say, with that, initially there was actually quite a few years there because I lived with a Scientology family. I was still very much connected to Scientology. And also, I thought, okay, well, I'd failed as a SEER member, but maybe I could be a good Scientologist. So I was very much still a Scientologist. And I thought um, that was all I knew. And I had not stepped outside of that. And it wasn't until my late 20s that I did. And along with that came the sort of realization that, okay, I really need to do something about this. Like, I've been struggling with this for so long. Scientology hasn't worked for me, basically, to try and heal this, what had happened to me as a child. And so that's when I sought counseling. But I just wanted to show in that like, yes, it does. It takes a long time to make your way out of that fog and to start addressing these things that had happened.
Well, yeah, and one of the things you point out in the piece that's so good is that one of the extra challenges, special challenges that people coming out of Scientology face
Mm.
is not just all these things you've already mentioned, like, you know, so many people come out of the Sea Org, they've never spent any time in the modern world. They don't have a bank account, they don't have any insurance
Right.
accounts, they don't have any documentation. That's a big enough challenge. But then,
Yeah.
added on top of that is this, that can be such a difficult life, and mentally it can be so tough on somebody. But then there's the thing about growing up in Scientology and having it absolutely pounded into your head that psychiatry is the last thing you would ever want to get near, and that
Yes.
the modern mental health field is the most evil force in the universe. And I thought you did a very good job explaining that that's getting over that was part of this whole journey for you.
Absolutely. And that is so true. It was very scary. And I had to weigh that up. It's like, I need to try and find a way to fix this broken part of me, I guess is how I sort of felt. Like this darkness, this heaviness, it had gotten so heavy. And I tried to run from it for so long, and I just couldn't. And I was so weighed down. I just thought it was to a point where I was just desperate for some help. And I had to weigh that up and be like, okay, is this a risk that I'm willing to take? And I sort of had to just like take a deep breath and arrive and go through those steps. And as well, like, I didn't immediately jump to, okay, I'm gonna, do a police report. It was months of counseling, um, and talking about what had happened, talking about the circumstances, in which I had grown up, to really kind of like release that up a bit. Um, it was very
Well,
difficult, and it was a very uncomfortable process. Like, yeah, it was not comfortable. It was
I
physically
mean,
uncomfortable.
I would imagine there would just be a period of finding the language to even speak of
Oh,
it with another person,
that's so true.
right?
That's so true. And I mean, language is just a whole other challenge as well. That's just another layer, having grown up in Scientology. When I was young, so like my first auditing session, Scientology auditing session, where I actually talk about it, um, the auditors sort of like, coaxing me along, and I'm just like, I don't have the word for it. So there was no word that I could point to in any kind of Scientology textbook, or there's this big book of definitions. Like, there was nothing in there that said about what I had experienced. And it was just fortunate that I also really enjoyed reading novels, and we'd watched movies, and I must have found this word somewhere or other, which was molest. Someone's been molested, and I was like, oh, okay, that's the word that describes it. And in fact, I couldn't even say that out loud. I had to write it down on a piece of paper. At that stage, I would have been about probably 14 years old. And I found it so hard to like get that out of me. It was incredibly difficult. So the counseling process, yeah, it was very hard. And then also there's like the layers, the Scientology sort of layers to it as well. I think it would be incredibly difficult for someone who wasn't, had never had anything to do with Scientology, um, especially. I think that other layer as well is that it was my father. That's
Sure.
so difficult to say. It's like,
Yeah.
my father sexually assaulted me on a number of occasions, from the time I was a very, very small child. In fact, my earliest memories are of that. And that is so, so difficult to try and extract that data and to, give that to somebody else.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what I wanted to also just say as well, is that I read an article recently, and it said, well, there was an Australian government survey, and it was 87% of sexual assaults go unreported. So 87%, of sexual assaults which occur do not get reported, and that's a huge, huge statistic. And I just wanted to sort of, point to that and say, there are already massive challenges to people in reporting these type of incidents, let alone the other layers that are sort of involved here. Yeah, I just sort of wanted to communicate that.
Well, it's a
It's
big
incredibly
challenge, and
difficult.
then Scientology just makes everything worse. You
Yes,
know,
absolutely.
definitely in your case, and then the one you cited involving Jan Eastgate is another one that's just
Yes.
horrendous.
Yes,
And
absolutely
uh,
horrendous.
and then with the Masterson, I mean, one of the challenges in this case is that time had taken, it's been quite a while since these incidents occurred.
Mhm.
But uh, all three of the women whose allegations are the subject of the trial next week,
Yes.
um, they all were Scientologists at the time. They
Yep.
were all very fearful of what the church would do, but also they didn't know about each other.
Yeah.
And this was, this is where I guess it's a little different than what you went through, was that eventually they found each other. And that's a really interesting story. I know some details. I hope I can tell those details. I'm kind of waiting for the to see what gets said in the trial.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting how these women found each other. And then once they have told me that they were horrified once they realized, wait, I'm not the only victim.
Right.
And then it becomes like, well, I've got to do something in case there are even others. And of course, in this case, my
There
goodness,
was. Yeah.
oh boy.
Okay, so Tony, that's such an important point, right? Okay, so when we have historical sexual assaults, and let's say one person takes it to the police, um, police are it's very, very difficult for police to prosecute a case. There is not a whole lot of evidence at that point in time, and they would likely say, I've witnessed this conversation taking place before, where they will say, well, look, it's just you, and so if it's just you, then we don't have a case. But if there's other people that are, have experienced the same thing from the same person, then you might have a chance. And like, and they that person might not even have known that at the time, but certainly the police know that it's very difficult to try and take that case any further without it, being without it having happened to a number of people. And so they've been really fortunate in that they were able to then discover each other eventually, and that would have absolutely helped in the prosecution, or will help in the prosecution of this case. And it also means that I believe that and also the fact that they must have a substantial amount of evidence for this to have moved forward in the way that it has. Eventually, I know it's taken a very long time. I wish that it was a shorter, um, process, but that, without a shred of doubt in my mind, I believe that there must be a substantial amount of evidence for this to come forward.
Well, there is, and
Yeah.
it's going to come out in the trial, and we're learning in these hearings just before trial, that just how much evidence there is and how many witnesses the prosecution is going to put on. But also, the other thing I
Yeah.
wanted to draw a little parallel to what you went through is it's so frustrating to hear about these ridiculous jurisdictional problems between the
Yes.
Australian
Yeah.
authorities and the California authorities, and California in particular, because in the case of the Masterson accusers, just to give you one example of what they and
Mhm.
see, this is what I wish people understood. There are
Yes.
still people that don't really understand this case very well, and we've been covering it so close for 5 years now. Just that one little example. The first detective they had with the LAPD back in 2016, when this thing finally got going, when they had discovered each other, went to the LAPD. They were assigned a detective, and that detective screwed up in so many ways. I'm
Mhm.
saying this based on reporting I've done. The
Mhm.
very first story I did in March 2017 had excerpts from a letter one of the women had written the chief of police about these problems. So that's what I'm drawing this from.
Yeah.
Just to give you one example, what they, you're right. One of the tough things about these cases is evidence. And
Right.
so, one way that police want to get that evidence are what's called controlled calls. So, they will ask
Yes.
they
Yes,
will
yes.
ask a woman, "We want you to call either the perpetrator or maybe somebody close to them,
Yes.
record while recording without the other person knowing," and the police can do this,
Yeah.
and see if you can get them to say something about it, right? And
Yeah.
so the LAPD detective gave them a burner phone and said, "Here, use this phone. Call up not Danny directly, but they wanted them to call like Danny's publicist, Danny's assistant, get
Yes.
them on the phone and see if they could, record them saying something that the police could use."
Yes.
And so these women got this burner phone. They're not dumb. The
Mhm.
first thing they did was they took the phone number of the burner phone and typed it into Google. And
Mhm.
immediately there were all these responses: "Cop phone, don't
Ugh,
use it."
jeez.
So this detective had given them a burner phone that had already been burnt in previous
Ugh,
investigations,
jeez.
and there were so this is, it's bad enough that these women are coming forward with rape allegations. They shouldn't
Right.
have to go through this Mickey Mouse garbage from the LAPD. Now, they were fortunate that detective was gotten rid of. They got another detective who was much better. But in each level of this, they've run into some of the things that you have as well. And so that's another reason why I was so glad you spoke up this week, to kind of let people know how difficult and slow these kinds of investigations are.
It's so difficult. And I draw on in the article that I wrote, and that was my intention as well, to show like there's this history here, and with regards to Carmen Rayner. Now, the case was dropped. There was, I believe, two counts of charges against Jan Eastgate. Now, the police dropped the charges, but why did they drop the charge? It was because they had filed the incorrect charge, because they had charged Jan Eastgate according to a law that was present much later on. It was not present at the time that the crime had occurred. So they had
Right.
charged her with the wrong um, crime, basically, or the wrong. It didn't exist at the time, but then they just dropped it completely. They didn't then go back and try and charge her with the correct one. It's absolute madness. And what we're talking about is a Scientology official coaching an 11-year-old girl and telling her to lie to authorities that her stepfather had been sexually assaulting her. Reframe that her stepfather, to say that her stepfather had not been sexually assaulting her, you
Right.
know, which had occurred from the ages between 7 years old to 11 years old. Like, this, it's
So it's
it's
not
so
it's not it's
horrendous.
it's not only bad enough that Scientology tries to handle all this stuff internally, and doesn't go to the authorities, but then to actively ask a child
Exactly.
to lie to the police. Why? In order to spare Scientology, right?
Yes. Yes.
And then the case just got messed up on a technicality because they filed into the wrong statute or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so these women in the Danny Masterson case, I'm certain that they have experienced a number of these things, which I and also others have experienced. And not only that, but at the beginning of it, you have to make a decision of like, am I willing to go up against the Church of Scientology? And that is a challenge, in and of itself. You're not just, making the decision to um, report and speak out about, the violence that you have experienced by a particular perpetrator, but there's so many decisions that you're actually making within that one thing. And it can be incredibly intimidating, incredibly daunting. And not only that, but they also experience um, the the tactics by the church, and I think went on for a number of years as well, where they were punished, that they were treated like a criminal. These women have gone through years and years and years of abuse following the actual rapes that took place. Like, it's just harrowing to think about it.
Oh, it's terrible. I mean, you know, Jane Doe 1 went immediately to the church to say Danny Masterson raped me. So they put her through uh, uh, past life counseling at Hollywood Celebrity Center,
Yeah,
costing her $15,000 to find things that happened in her past lives, the evil things she had done in past lives in other centuries, other millennia,
to
that
pull it in.
would make her a victim in this life. Yeah,
Yes, yeah.
and it's just amazing. But that's the Scientology way.
Yeah, and I mean, I have personal experience to that. And when I've read the stories of these women, like it rings so true. It's so crystal clear to me that these things occurred. When I was 17, and as I mentioned before, I was leaving the Sea Org, and actually at that time I was on the RPF. And there is a sec check that you need to do before you leave the Sea Org. And so that security check, which is like a confessional, so you're on the e-meter and they're asking you pre-prepared questions. And usually there's actually just like a sort of a set list of questions, but mine were specifically tailored to me. And the questions are asked, and it's like the questions were basically like, what did you do to make your father do this to you? I
Oh
just like
God.
couldn't believe it.
Oh.
I was actually quite angry at the time. I was like, yeah, just letting off a few swear words. I was like, this is absolute bullshit. I'm not effing doing this. Like, you guys can all get effed. Like, I was just so completely outraged. Um, yeah, like it was,
Incredible.
yeah. So yes, they absolutely do that. Um, yeah, and so I absolutely believe it. Believe that that happened.
Well, based on your own experiences, can you understand that this has been a very, very difficult 5 years for these women? That they've just been at their wits' end at times, and it just seemed like it was never
Absolutely.
gonna come.
Absolutely. And I'm sure that at certain times they, would have had the thought of like, do I just give up? Like, do I just walk away? What they've been up against is just, I think it would be very, very difficult to understand unless, you were in their shoes. And I'm sure the degrees of difficulty that, that may never be completely, um, communicated or understood. It's incredibly hard. And also because I talk about these little steps that you have to kind of take along the way, and you have to understand that, like, yes, this is going to take a long time, but they definitely had other things that they had to deal with in the meantime throughout this entire process, back from when they first reported it within Scientology. And also, as you said, like, they didn't think, they thought that they were the only ones that had experienced it, So they were
Yeah.
completely alone, and they were up against a massive organization that had complete power and control over them. And it's just, yeah, it's very, very, it would have been a very scary process right the way through.
Yeah, and you mentioned what you said is absolutely true. Not only have they had to deal with the police making mistakes, they've had to deal with some
Right.
prosecutors. I won't say making mistakes, but the prosecutors have not always made it, all wonderful for them. It's been
Easy.
difficult. Well, I
Yeah.
mean, like it took so long for the prosecutor charge to begin with, but generally, I think they're getting really good work out of the police and the prosecutors now. They're obviously getting down
Hmm.
to it. Um, but there's another layer, and that is this whole time they've been getting harassed.
Yes.
And I don't know if you saw this detail we reported the other day, but the prosecutor Reinhold Mueller in court a week ago or so indicated that they plan, as part of their case, to bring in more than 20
Yes.
incidents of harassment. So, there's this civil lawsuit where they're trying to prove the harassment, but in the criminal case, the government, the people, the district attorney are going to come in with evidence to show that these women are going through harassment. And I mean, I knew they were going through harassment. I know that there's evidence of it. There's very good evidence of it. But
Yes.
I thought we'd have to wait until the civil trial. I didn't know it was going to be
Right.
part of the criminal trial.
Which is
But
amazing that
but it's just
that's being brought in. I mean, that's absolutely amazing. And the thing is, it's in a very important part of the case, and it's a very important part of why these women, um, didn't immediately come to the LAPD to place a report. This is part
right.
of the story of their experience. That this whole thing has been, such a big ordeal. I also wanted to talk about another thing as well. It's
Yeah.
really difficult, and this has absolutely been the case, with these women's experience. So yes, the issue is can be a lack of evidence, but what do you do when it's an organization that is withholding the evidence that you require for
Right.
your case?
Good point.
Um, right. And that organization is, they're not going to release that. Um, they're trying to protect themselves. So that you're up against this huge difficulty. So I know from, like, just to draw back on my own experiences, um, this would have been 2013. So it was after I had first done the first police report. And at this stage, it was being investigated actively. So the police officer asked me if I could reach out to anyone who might know about it and see if I can, see if they'd be willing to provide a police statement. And I'd asked my mother at that time, and she said, first of all, she was like, "Oh, I'm really disappointed in you that you went to the police. You're not supposed to do that."
Wow.
Um, and and then she said, and I said, "Well, would you be willing to provide a police statement?" She was like, "Oh, I can't give you an answer. I need to," and I quote, "consult internally within the church." Okay. So this is not a mother who is available to me to provide any kind of, um, you know, support, I guess you could say. She is completely owned by the Church of Scientology because she, is not willing to make any sort of movements or decisions without them giving her blessing, basically. So she did consult internally within the church, and 3 weeks later, she called me and said, "No, I'm not willing to write a statement." And then she went on to say, "Oh, couldn't you just ask for him to apologize to you?" Was the first thing. And then the second thing was, she's like, "I know that he owns property and he could maybe give you some money." But she was absolutely against the idea of me pursuing things with the police, and again tried to dissuade me and um, yeah, and basically in offering those other solutions, she was, trying to prevent me from moving forwards. Um, so that was really difficult because I knew that she had had knowledge of it since I was 12 years old. And in fact, the police officer said that he had had email conversations with her where she said that my father came to her and confessed to her directly. But he wasn't sure if he could use that as evidence. A written statement is obviously the better thing.
Right.
So these are the kind of things that they're coming up against, and as well as there's a history as well of where it was recorded within the church that this had happened. And in fact, when I did Scientology in the aftermath, they didn't try and discount or discredit that this had happened to me. So, and in fact, they actually admit knowledge of it, and they just basically changed their time frame of when they found out about it. They had known for many years before they actually said that they became aware of it. But yeah, but that was only with the knowledge that I had already had this history of going to the police, and I had and my case was active and all that sort of thing. I had that to sort of help me, but certainly they're not going to be willing to release any documentation that says that they knew about it.
Right. And that, they're actively trying to keep the case from going forward.
Absolutely.
On the other hand, one of the interesting characteristics of Scientology is that they do write everything down. And
Absolutely.
they keep track of everything. And I think in the Masterson case, we're going to see some documents, and we're going to see some. There is a parallel, I think, with a family of situation. I should probably not say more than that. I know some things, but we're going to see how it comes. It's coming out soon, and we'll
Yeah,
see
I
how it
can't
goes in
wait.
trial. But definitely are documents in this case, and some of them are church documents, I believe. So that's the Scientology may try to keep things under wraps, but it does keep records of everything, and
Yes.
if you can just get them to open the books or something. But that should be interesting as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I would love, absolutely loved in future, and I don't know this will if it will ever come to pass, but for people to have access to those records, and I feel like that is a person's right. But I don't know that they would ever do that willingly. But yeah, I am very interested to see what happens with this trial, and absolutely hoping for an outcome for these women who have gone through so much, and the delays and which have been requested. Like, it's just absolutely, just the whole way through has just been, I'm sure, an absolute nightmare. And as well, I was just going to say about the arbitration at one stage. I think there was a previous judge who had
Well,
required
that's the civil
arbitration.
case.
This is
That's
a
the
civil
civil
one. Okay.
case.
Yeah.
Separate case, but
Yeah.
parallel. Yeah.
Yeah. I just couldn't, like, I remember seeing that and just like, I just couldn't believe it. Like, if, you know, it just was like, that is just an absolute nightmare. Yeah. So I just absolutely wish all the best for these women, and yeah, we'll see what happens. And do you know how much information we'll have access to during the trial?
Well, I have I was put on the list. I requested, and I was put on the list to be one of the reporters that gets to cover the trial from gavel to
Wow.
gavel. I'll
Yeah.
be flying there this weekend, and jury selection begins on Tuesday, October 11th. I
Yeah.
have been told by the court that during jury selection, which may last several days, they only want one reporter in the room at a time, and then the reporters
Okay.
will all be sharing that pool reporters' notes.
Information. Yeah.
Um, and that's some people think that jury selection for a case like this would take a week. Judge Olmedo says she could do it in 2 days. I don't know, because
Yeah.
one of the things that's going to be special for this is, both the prosecution and the defense get to have input on the questionnaire. Of course, they're going to quiz every potential juror about, have you ever been in Scientology? Have you ever
Yeah.
read Dianetics? Do you know the history, anything about Scientology? Have you heard of Danny Masterson? So I can imagine that it may take a while But Judge Olmedo seems to think that that'll go pretty quick. Then we'll get right into opening statements and then testimony. The way the preliminary hearing worked last year in Los Angeles, they put on Jane Doe number one first, and
Mm,
she gave testimony, and then Tom Mesereau cross-examined her, and that took a few days. So I assume it'll be something like that this time. I don't know the order of witnesses, but that's the way it
mm,
went in the preliminary hearing. And so they'll have the victims testify. Then there are other people that are going to testify. Law enforcement officials are going to testify, and I believe some documents are going to come in. So that could take quite a while. I believe at this point that the defense is not going to call witnesses of their own. They're just going to cross-examine the prosecution witnesses, which I think is fairly typical for a case like this. As
mhm,
far as your question on under the getting the information, Judge Olmedo early on said because of the nature of the crimes, 3 counts of forcible rape against 3 different women, and
mhm,
those women being in the courtroom, and 2 of them going by Jane Doe 1, Jane Doe 2, and not using their names.
mhm.
Judge Olmedo very early on said there will not be cameras in this courtroom.
Yeah,
So
that's fair.
nobody's going to be able to watch that. But I'll be there. I'll be there all day, every day. I'll be running out. If you remember how it went down at the preliminary hearing last year, at every break, I ran out to the hallway and gave an update to everybody at the website. So, and there will be a lot of reporters there. I won't, plenty of reporters doing very good work, but I'll be doing my best to, because people know the underground bunker people know that I tend to focus on real little details that the other press doesn't. But
Mm.
they'll be able to see a lot of different versions of it. But there should be a ton of reporting going on from that case, and people will be able to follow along. So I hope sounds like you know the case pretty well yourself.
Just bits and pieces. I've definitely sort of like kept an eye on it, here and there, just gotten a bit of an update. Yeah, because having had some similar experiences, I guess, I do feel, um, I what can I say? Like, I guess, is it empathy? It's like I understand some of what these women have been through. So yeah, I just
Well, I
really hope the
thought
best for them. Yeah.
Well, I thought your piece this week was so well timed. Thank you so much for we haven't talked in a while. I'm so glad you contacted me again, and your piece was so perfectly timed. I think it will educate people because
Thank
look,
you.
people are going to hear about Danny, right? They're going to
Mhm.
hear about Danny's acting, Danny's family, Danny's involvement in Scientology,
Yes.
Danny's past with these, one of the women he was actually had a relationship with, and all this focus on Danny, and I think somewhat gets lost
The
what these
story, yeah, absolutely.
because the defense is look the defense in a case like this always goes one way, and that is to trash these women. They're going to
Mhm.
trash their memories, their stories, their credibility, their motives. It's just going to be trash, trash, trash. And I look, that's just the way these cases go, and we'll see what the jury thinks. But I want people to understand, even before that first gavel falls,
Mhm.
what these women have been through for all
Absolutely.
these years. And so that's why I thank you that you wrote that piece, because you have given our readers a glimpse of what that journey is like, because you've certainly been through it yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope as well, like, that it can be seen that's just like a little tiny part of the piece. That was, the lead up to when I first made my first police report. And I have done more police reports since then, and the process is so grueling to sit down and pull apart and to go back there and relive those things. It's just, the other thing as well, I will say, when you're providing a police report, it's like it's not just good enough to say, like, my dad did this to me, right? Or this person did this to me. You have to, you know drill down into every single detail. Where was the window positioned? Where was the bed positioned? Where,
Right, right.
I had to, in 2013, when I did like a very intensive police statement, which took all day. And part of that, where I was, I had to write out diagrams of the layout. So for every single instant that occurred, I had to do a diagram of the layout of the room, you know, to that level of detail. And and to describe things, describe what had happened. And it's very difficult. So even just that part of the process, and then that's not even the end of it. And then there's years of just waiting to see if it's going to go anywhere, and following up. And it's just this, it's, and then, and that's not even to where you haven't even arrived at the courtroom yet, which is an incredibly intimidating experience in itself. So I hope that, like, I can just provide some little bit of my experience to give some understanding that, um, yeah, it's a really difficult thing to try and go down this route of reporting to the police, and then also what happens after that. And that's even if you get, in the end, you might not get a successful result. And in fact, in Australia, the conviction rate is 1.5%. It's just like, it's very
Yeah.
difficult.
Well, I think you've done a wonderful thing and you've helped us understand that situation. And I really, am grateful that you reached out to us. And I hope that as this thing goes forward, we can talk to you about some other things as well.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
All
Thanks so
right.
much,
Thank you so
Tony.
much, Miriam. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Now I won't go down in Bunker Town again, again, again to witness history, ride the storm, wait to see how reckoning and the day they all come. Oh, but I'm hunkered down in Bunker Town again, again, again.